Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar, Maximizing L&D Spend with a Data-Driven Content Strategy. Our presenters today are David Wentworth, Principal Learning Analyst at Brandon Hall Group, and Marc Zao-Sanders, CEO at Filtered. I would like to extend a thank you to Filtered for sponsoring today's webinar. Filtered helps organizations maximize the impact of learning spend by deciding on the right skills and matching them to the right content. They drive end-user engagement through a focused LXP and personalized emails backed by powerful curation. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with Brandon Hall Group, we are a research and analyst firm that empowers excellence in organizations around the world through our research and tools. A quick mention that our certification programs are currently open, and we do offer programs to become a certified learning strategist, a certified diversity, equity, and inclusion leader or champion, and more. So please visit our main website for more information. Your participation in our surveys is one of the most crucial components of our research. So if you do have a few minutes to spare and you see a topic that you would like to take a survey for, it's greatly appreciated. All participants do receive a piece of complimentary research once the results have been analyzed. And again, you can visit our website for more information and access to those surveys. And lastly, a few logistics. This presentation is being recorded. The recording and the slides will be provided to everyone within 24 hours of the webinar in a follow-up email. If you would like to ask a question, please do so by typing it into the question box for our presenters. And finally, if you would like to download a copy of today's presentation instantly, you may do so in the handout section, also available on your control panel. And without any further delay, I will turn it over to Dave so we can get started.
Great, thanks, Melissa. And as always, I like to leave this up for a couple seconds here. Just familiarize yourself with that control panel. That is the way you're going to be able to ask Marc and I questions today, or you can just share any thoughts you might have, any insights that you want to provide. That's the way you'll be able to communicate with us. So we're going to keep an eye on that question box throughout and try to answer any relevant questions as they come in. We'll also have a little bit of time at the end to answer any questions we may have missed or put on hold, or any new questions that come in at that time. So again, please feel free to use that. We love to hear from you. We love the questions. We want to make this as interactive as possible in this webinar format. So as Melissa had mentioned, Marc and I today are going to be talking about an intelligent content strategy. And one of the big reasons why we wanted to talk about that is there's such a big shift currently going on within L&D, and I think all of you are, acutely aware of these things. But I wanted to use some of our most recent research to sort of lay out the environment in which this conversation is taking place and why there's an impetus to think through these things, maybe take another look at the way your organization either thinks about or approaches your learning content. First we take a look at the way the learning budget is broken out. And in our most recent State of Learning Practices study, we asked organizations to break down their L&D budget across three very basic, big picture buckets. So you've got your headcount, which makes up the biggest group portion of the budget, nearly half. And then the rest is split across learning technology, so specific tools and technologies that companies are using for learning, whether it's creating the content, delivering it, what have you. And then the rest is in that non-technical spending. So you're spending content administration, maybe you're doing some outsourcing. So that 30% represents for a lot of organizations a large amount of money, a large amount of spending. It's also typically the spending that's the hardest to keep track of. There's so many moving parts, so many different things happening there that maybe don't have the same kind of governance as something like technology or headcount would have. And so it's really important to, in areas where we can, to spend a little time and really dig into what is the spend, what's going on there, and how do we maximize that. And I think so that 29%, that purple, is an important section of the budget that tends to get overlooked because it's not as clean as the others, but that's what makes it so opportune for reimagining and streamlining. So that's sort of where we want to start today to think about these things. And obviously the past 18 months have been pretty dramatic in what has happened to organizations, a lot of different changes in a lot of different directions. One thing we did see is for years, L&D budgets had remained relatively stagnant, not a lot of increase, but also not much decrease either. And so, there's been a long history of L&D trying to do more without any increase in their budget. Well, that's actually been completely exacerbated over the last 18 months or so, right? We ask companies if they've seen their per learner budgets, so how much you're spending per each learner per year, has that been decreased or increased during the pandemic? And for nearly half of organizations, it's actually decreased. So we're significantly seeing a lot more decrease than we have in the past. In fact, only 10% of companies said that they have seen an increase in their per learner spending budget. And then we asked for those organizations that say that they do have a budget cut of some kind, how much? And for most, like 48%, the largest group anyway, it's less than a quarter of the budget. But then you see even 15% have seen more than 75% cut in the budget. You add that to the 11% that have seen anywhere from a half to 3/4 of the budget cut. There's a significant cut in the resources that are available for L&D. And this is all happening at a time when organizations are relying even more heavily on L&D to accomplish what needs to get done in this time, whether it's upskilling and reskilling the workforce because the business needs have changed, keeping workers connected because they're now a majority remote. They hadn't been before, and learning sort of has the tools and the infrastructure in place to reach out to those kinds of audiences, so they're getting leaned on to do that. So while learning's strategic profile has increased, their resources and their ability to do things has decreased, which just puts the things that we're talking about today in much sharper focus. The idea of where can we maximize the spend that we've got, seeing as how it's being strained to the limit as it is. And Marc, at this point, this is where I would love you to come in and just say hi, and let me know what you think when you see these sort of things from the budgets, whether it's just your reaction to the data or the things that you're hearing from companies that you work with or what you're hearing in the industry.
Hi, Dave. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I think we're definitely seeing that there's some pressure on budget. So just like your data is revealing, it's we're also hearing though that it's not just less to spend. It's sometimes it's just the same budget to spend, but there's just more scrutiny on the justification. So the business case needs to be that much tighter. There needs to be some more data. And we'll be talking about that over the course of this session. But yeah, it's not just that it's less and kind of you have less money to spend, but also look, if you're gonna spend anywhere near the same amount or the same amount, then you need to justify it better, and data is obviously a big part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the other more specific pressures that organizations are feeling in this environment is clearly, if you go back prior to the pandemic, there had been a lot of discussion, a lot of talk about the digital transformation of learning, of the organization as a whole. Progress has been relatively slow on that front. Organizations had been sort of mapping out what their plans were, what they thought they might do, but had still been relying on mostly their traditional methods of delivering and measuring learning. And then when the pandemic hits, whatever plans they may have had, whatever thoughts they had, have been just shifted into overdrive. And there had to be an immediate shift into a digital transformation. And we saw that go on, and we looked in our studies. And this, we've been asking this throughout the pandemic, starting in March of 2020. This data is more recent, as of the middle of this year. And we asked, okay, as the pandemic eases, whenever and however that may occur, what do you see happening in your organization in terms of digital learning? What will be the trajectory of your use of digital learning? And what we have here is the 51% saying that it'll continue to increase. It's actually going to increase more than what we're doing right now in the current environment. But if you look overall, only 8% of companies say that their use of digital learning will probably go back to what they were doing prior to the pandemic. For everyone else, there's going to be more digital learning than there was in the past, whether that's significantly more, like a continued increase after the pandemic, or maybe when the pandemic eases off, they roll back digital learning a bit, but still not down below or to pre-pandemic levels. So at the end of the day, the result is whatever organizations have been doing from a digital learning standpoint, they will be doing more of that in the future. And that requires a whole lot of new ideas, strategy, rethinking, and of course, as you know, we talk about the topic today, that has a huge impact on learning content, what that looks like, where it comes from, how it's managed. And so there's a lot more scrutiny on, do we have the content available to us to exist and to be successful in a more digital environment for learning?
Yeah, is it going to be good enough? Yeah. The way I was reading that slide, Dave, if you just go back, one was just, you know, the middle two columns say that 3/4 of people will be doing more digital learning, you know, than pre-COVID levels. And it's not just the amount. Okay, so if they're doing more, then obviously we want to get them looking at the right stuff that's going to, you know, really make an impact. And I think we'll talk about that a little bit later on as well. But I think there's also more firms that are thinking about their role in society and this concept of the extended enterprise. And so, you know, it's not just about educating your workforce, but maybe the families of your workforce, or just wider, you know, the society as a whole. So that will further increase, you know, consumption of digital learning. So, and even more important that we know what's good and what's relevant and what's going to be, you know, make an impact on people. So yeah, so it's middle two bars for me. 3/4 of people could be doing more than before the pandemic hit.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, because not only is it just that there's going to be more, you know, use of these tools because of the environment, but you're very, you know, 100% correct that the types of things that organizations will find themselves, like the breadth of what they are trying to deliver from a learning standpoint, will grow. We've seen an increase in the need for things like coping skills, resiliency, the idea of how do we make sure that employees feel that, you know, that they are included and that they belong. Learning has a lot to do with a lot of these things, and so these are areas that maybe the L&D department hadn't been focused on previously. They've increased in importance, and so that just broadens the spectrum of the things that companies need to pull together to operate in this environment. And, you know, one of the things that we found, we had asked organizations about their learning tools and technologies. And so what you see here is low impact and high impact. And what that means is the companies in green, those high impact companies, are the companies that say their learning approach is having a strong positive impact on a series of outcomes like employee engagement, individual performance, time to productivity, things like that. And then the gray, the low impact, are companies that say that their approach is not having that strong of an impact on those outcomes. And so then we want to see, what are those companies doing differently in terms of their approach? And what we see is that these high impact companies are far more likely to be using a wider variety of tools, technologies, and modalities. Video for learning, I mean, the difference is massive. You know, 79% of these high impact companies say they use it regularly or frequently, as opposed to 21% of the low impact companies. You see the same for coaching and mentoring opportunities, informal peer-to-peer learning, micro-learning, it goes on and on. And so as organizations recognize the effectiveness and the impact that these kinds of learning experiences have, again, it calls into mind, do we have the types of content, the material that can support this, that fits into this, that works in these kind of environments? Because if we think back just a few short years, or even currently today, most of what organizations have available to them is what we'd call legacy content, right? Sort of the big SCORM packages, learning programs from an e-learning standpoint that don't necessarily lend themselves to any or of these modalities that we're seeing on the screen.
Yeah, and it's, yeah, there's so much nuance to it. If you look at any of those categories, there's such a thing. As actually this data is showing you that, you know, there's low impact video learning and there's high impact video learning. And the same is true for, you know, for any of these modalities. I was slightly surprised actually that coaching and mentoring doesn't have an even higher high impact score, because it's, you know, by far the most labor intensive and you know, and costly of the modalities here. But really the point I want to make about this this slide is that you've got with each of these, there's some brilliant content if you find it, and that really is that, you know, that's the L&D and the the curator in particular, that's the nightmare, and the opportunity is finding the really good stuff. So a slide like this is really good use data to start a conversation. But if you're thinking about your company and your content, the content that you have access to, that you want to bring to your workforce, it's thinking about the quality that lies beneath this, and how do you get to the really good stuff. And like you're saying, Dave, how is there enough given the increased demand of for digital learning? Is there enough of the right stuff?
Yeah, precisely. And when we think about that question, right, is there enough of the right stuff? We take a look, we asked organizations, where is your content coming from? How are you creating it, or where are you purchasing it? What is the source of the content? And for the vast majority of companies, 79% say, shows, oh, yeah, we use some sort of PowerPoint type presentation creation tool. So we're basically building slides, presentations for our learning programs. And that's how most of the learning programs exist. And then you see things like, a video capture tool or a desktop authoring tool, which would be more of a more formalized learning program created, but still, essentially the same kind of click-through type of content. 55% say they get it right out off the internet. We're pulling content from the internet that we think is valuable, or they're using a cloud-based authoring tool to allow multiple authors to work on the same content at the same time. Maybe they're going to a third party to have something custom built. So you've got 41% say that they're doing that. Half of companies say they're purchasing third-party off-the-shelf content. But what this does is it illuminates the wide variety and complexity of the content that is available. So it just kind of showcases two things. One is that there is a vast majority of legacy type content, sort of static, large event-based type learning content available. But there's also a very wide variety of places that it comes from and ways that it's put together. So that can create a very big, broad, deep, complex content environment for a lot of organizations to try to manage, try to figure out. And again, this goes back to why this is an important thing from that budget standpoint, that spend, because for all of these items that exist, there's been some sort of investment in that content. But because of the nature of it, and that it's hard to manage, hard to find, a lot of times it gets replicated and things get rebuilt because companies aren't able to manage all this content. And so they're actually duplicating their efforts, and they're actually recreating the spend. And there's a lot of waste that goes on there because they don't have a great content strategy. And that's why, we wanted to talk to Marc a bit today about, well, how can you think about content in a better way? And as Marc puts it, use content intelligence as you look at the content that's available to your organization. So Marc, I was going to turn it over to you for that.
Oh, cool. I mean, I'll definitely talk about that in a second. If you could just go back one slide there to your one. Seeing this, I'd not really appreciated how many different ways there are of making content. The way that we think of it is three buckets. There's proprietary content, which is created by the company or someone at the the company, and then there's the libraries, and then there's the web, which is picked up in this. But actually, most of the items here are ways of creating content from within the company for that company. And the interesting thing that we find with this is that content, as you can probably you'd probably guess, but our data bears out, is the most relevant to that firm and to their industry because they've created it themselves, right? That makes sense. But it is the least well tagged. It has the least amount of metadata. So you can see that there's a big opportunity if you can lift a lot of that content, which is the most relevant, created by your workforce, lift it out from obscurity and surface it in the right way for the right people. So yeah, we think of it in three buckets. So there's kind of a simplified version of this slide that that we have. But I think it's worth thinking about the stuff that your colleagues create as a really important and not very well understood because of the lack of metadata. if you think about, the internet that needs to be well tagged, because otherwise, those web pages don't get found. And with the library content, that needs to be well tagged because, in producing it, that's part of the system. Within a company, there's less process about the publication and creation of content. So, work to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, so staying with me. So content intelligence. So content intelligence is this is something that we've created. It sort of presupposes that there is such an idea of something like the right content for an organization. What we mean by that is that it's aligned to the skills that your organization needs to develop, and to the to the quality that you need it, and in the modalities that your workforce enjoys and get something from. And a foundational part of that, I've mentioned it already, in this webinar, is tagging, and tagging content at scale. So tagging it as well as a human being can tag content, and obviously a lot faster. The reason it's important is that that's foundational. If you understand your content in terms of important tags, in terms of the high value skills of your organization, you can just get a lot more from it. So that data in and of itself is useful for making internal business cases and being persuasive. But then more tangibly, it's curation. It's aggregating up at the level of the library, so you can say, well, this particular library, and I won't mention any here on this call, but they're less well aligned or more well aligned to the high value skills that you're thinking about or should be thinking about. So it makes it gives you the data to make some spend decisions, procurement decisions with that data-driven decision making that that people talk about. And then there's discovery as well. So if you've got well-tagged content, then people are going to find it because it's tagged, it's in the right pathway, it's searchable. It's just again, it's just surfacing. It's about surfacing the right the most relevant content for for a user when it comes to discoverability. So there's several benefits. And overall, like I say, I think one thing that's missing or been missing for a lot of people working in L&D for for a long time is having the data at their disposal to make the right decisions, and this is part of what content intelligence is about.
Yeah, and I think that's so true. That one thing that we hear when we work with organizations is some of the decisions that they're trying to make are very difficult for them to make, and because they either I don't want to say don't have the data, because typically the data exists somewhere, but they haven't gathered it correctly. They haven't been able to analyze it and able to use it. And what this does is, by taking this kind of approach, that data-driven approach, makes these decisions far easier to make. And then you've got sort of that as your foundation, that backup as to why the decisions get made. And it just continues. The more that you go down this path, the smarter the process gets, because it's continually built on that data, and you're continually collecting and adding to that and analyzing it. So it just gets better over time.
Yeah, exactly. I wouldn't say it makes the decisions easy, but it does make them easier. So very often, I was going to actually talk about this in a few slides' time, but I think it's kind of come up now, Dave. Very often there'll be a hunch that from someone that works in L&D that such and such library is not that effective for our workforce, but they know that there are some big fans of it still within the within the company. So you have this kind of inertia of like a 3 to 5 year deal that then gets extended, and no one dares get out of that contract because someone at the company is going to get upset if it happens. What data does is give you a way of comparing libraries so that you can make a decision. And then if someone's not happy with it, you've got the data to say, look, this is why we made the decision. This is what the data said. And you can scrutinize that, but at least it wasn't just on the on a whim, or just just an opinion. So right. That's the empowering thing that this sort of thing can do. There is loads of data at the moment, but it's very hard to compare like for like. That's the thing. So if you get the skills, and actually that's what the next slide, Dave, if you move on to onto that. So there's this cliche in L&D that skills are the common currency. talked about a lot in those terms. What I mean by that, what we mean by that, is that they're common to both the role and to content. So fundamentally, there's a job and it's about such and such skills, and there's content and it's about such and such skills, and you're trying to match the two in order to develop as one of the means of developing skills further. So if you've got that common currency, then you can compare different libraries or different actual learning assets, learning objects for relevance to a particular set of skills that you want to develop at your workforce. So the first step for us, and I think for a lot of vendors that are either selling an LXP or even an LMS or content, the conversation should start at least with the business problem that you have, the priorities that you have in mind, and the skills that you need to develop to achieve those. So it always starts with us with the conversation about skills. And so we have our own skills framework. Very often clients will have their own sort of preconceived ideas, and there's some sort of match between the two. I would say though that although every company is different, there's a huge commonality with skills. I would say something like 80% of the knowledge worker skills sound and are very similar from large or medium-sized company to large or medium-sized company. So one of the things that we've noticed is that companies tie themselves in knots about what framework to use, and spend years, literally years, and millions of dollars, pounds, euros on trying to decide on the perfect skills framework. But one, no such thing exists. Two, it's going to change, because skills, there's always new skills that come. And you can make a lot of progress by just saying, look, here are some important skills that are important for us and they're important for a lot of other companies out there. Get going with that, and just make sure that the system that you have, and whatever system it is that you use, whether you're working with us filtered or you're working with anyone else, make sure it's extensible and flexible, so that because there will be new things that happen, and as we've seen lots over the last few years and last year and a half in particular, the world can change suddenly.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is reflected in some of the data that we've collected. We asked organizations what was most important to them, on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being not at all important, 5 being critically important to the business. And you can see, leadership development, leadership skills, and number 1. Of course, that's obviously includes a vast array of sub skills, things like emotional intelligence and design thinking and empathy and all those kinds of things. But then also organizations are very concerned about this upskilling and reskilling for the organization's future needs. And I think that really gets at what, Marc, you were just saying about that framework, that desire to have this permanent list, this taxonomy that helps them map out what the skills are. But the truth is, you can't really know that. And it's really more about, like you said, creating an environment that allows the organization to map and build to those skills as they become apparent, rather than having this existing list. So being able to upskill and reskill as needed, that's important, but also training in the skills that we need now. And then you see some of the others, team development, DE&I is very important. Soft skills, which, depending on how you look at them, some of them are quite critical. But you see that the list of different things, and things that are on this list that maybe weren't on this list previously, or maybe not as high on this list, things like coping skills. Like I mentioned, the skills around DE&I have really grown in importance in recent years. So as Marc was saying, you may have an idea of what is important to the organization, but it does shift in priority over time, and you need to be able to have a learning environment that adapts to that. So that this mapping that Marc's talking about is what's going to allow you to be more flexible and agile as these things change over time. Anything here that stands out to you, Marc?
Yeah, a couple of things. Leadership is top of every single list in L&D where skills are mentioned. It's only by 3% in this particular case, but it's generally at the top. And I think, again, like if you're thinking about your company, you need to think beyond leadership and to break it down. I think you were alluding to that, Dave, but what kind of leaders are, especially going forwards in the future, going to be most effective at your company? What are you hiring for? What are you trying to cultivate? Is it the visionary leader, compassionate leader, commercial, managerial, mindful, well networked. There's so much, again, nuance underneath, and this is where, if you're thinking about content, okay, so you're going to have on your system a bunch of content that's tagged to leadership. That's not that useful though, because although people are searching for leadership, if they just search for leadership and they get 600 search results that are about leadership within such a sort of big blanket way, that's, it's quite hard to deal with that and process that as a user. But if instead you've encouraged the workforce, well, one, you've tagged your content, so it's much more nuanced. So you've got something like mindful leadership, and then you've also developed the culture of the company such that, and the trust of the company and the systems that you have, that they're more likely to, the search query is more likely to be mindful leadership or compassionate leadership. Then the results are so much more relevant, and the experience is much more like you get with Google. In Google, you can put in really specific search terms and get something meaningful back. So yeah, I guess what I'm saying is leadership is a big bucket. I mean, a number of these are quite big buckets. And again, but the Brandon Hall research is great for starting the conversation. But as you're thinking about your firm, you need to drill down. The other thing, Dave, I was going to say was about coping, actually. So like you said, it's often talked about as being, I would describe as with a different word, resilience. And I think this is where, thinking about skills at the outset, it really matters. The naming matters, actually. So there's a big difference between the meanings or the associations, the connotations of coping and resilience, and what you would tag with those. So, with coping, just imagine if you tagged a load of internet content that was about coping, you're going to get some pretty raw stuff that comes up. Now, that might be fine for your context and your organization, or it might not be. So this is why being intentional about your skills at the start. So which skills should we have? What should we name them? And what should we mean by each of those? It actually makes quite a big difference to the the end user experience, which is often overlooked in our experience.
Absolutely. So let's dig in a little bit into this the framework that you had started to mention.
Right, so developing a skills framework. Well, there's kind of two models. This is the complex way. There's a complex way and a simple way. The simple way is just to say, like I was actually advocating before, there are so many skills that are common amongst knowledge workers and workforces generally. So just get started with them. We have a skills palette, as we call it, of 100 skills, each of which can be tweaked a bit. So 100 can become quite a bit more than that quite quickly. And that, I think, is the more I wouldn't say sensible, but it's the faster start to getting to a skills framework. The more complex way, which is on this slide, is basically looking at the data that pertains to the skills that you want to develop. So that's kind of future skills. It's any skills framework that you've already got. It's search queries that people put into extranets and intranets and SharePoint and LXPs and what have you. It's what else is it? Job descriptions. So it's just synthesizing a lot of disparate data sources to come up with this one skills framework that's going to be still flexible, but really taking in a lot of data inputs. We've done this with a number of clients. But like I said, there's another approach, which is maybe the next slide, which is more kind of take things as they are. Yeah, so what you've got there is some of the skills from our skills palette, and a lot of these terms, data security, business intelligence, they'll have similar names. You might think of them with a different couple of words or single word. But what we've got underneath each of these is a definition, which is partly numeric actually, and partly words associated with that skill. So if it's not quite right, what we have, which is what we mean by business intelligence doesn't exactly match what you mean by business intelligence, then that can be tweaked. Actually, the example I normally give, which you can't see on this slide, is what is it? It's resilience, actually. So resilience can or cannot include sleep management. You may want it to, and you may not want it to, and there's all sorts of arguments for and against. I think in our definition of resilience, we do include some element of sleep management, but let's say you didn't want that at all. Well, you just cut that out. but the point is to be intentional about it. So, we thought about resilience. We considered sleep management as being something that our workforce, should learn more about and sleep better. But we decided to cut it out for whatever reasons, so that you end up with a skills framework which you really mean, and is right for your workforce, rather than just sort of taking taking a definition or a skills concept from a vendor. I think being flexible is important.
Yeah, and that is something that we see all the time. We, as an advisory organization, companies come to us and they ask for those lists and those taxonomies, and that's the sort of the conversation that we have, is that they do exist in places and you can get them, but does it make the most sense for your organization? I think there's obviously people like easy answers, simple answers, and so getting a list that already exists makes that work simpler. But the truth is, does that really apply to how your organization thinks about those things, the skills your organization really needs? Because that's the other thing we find in these conversations, is that organizations are relatively unique from one to the next in what they think is important, what works for them, what their vision, their mission is, and do these things align? So the ability to take maybe a foundational list and rework it so that it matches better to your organization's DNA is critical. It isn't about just taking these lists and storing them away and using them moving forward. You really have to, shape them to match the organization and revisit that and change it over time if necessary.
Yeah, and if you don't have the granularity, or the vendor you're talking to doesn't allow you access to to be able to see what they really mean by some of these, then it'll be difficult. Another one that's just on a lot of people's minds, or has been the last 2, 3, maybe 5 years, is growth mindset. Growth mindset has in the the term growth mindset. So for a lot of people, or for a lot of companies, it's become an important part of how they think about skills and development, and sometimes there's some very strong opinions about what a mindset is, as separate from a skill set. So if there are those strong opinions at the at your place, then you need to, it's even more important to be able to be intentional about what you mean by growth mindset. Does it include, for example, learning agility? Does it include resilience? Does it include sleep management? All of these questions, which is, it doesn't need to take that long to do, by the way. I don't want to say that, tweaking your skills framework needs to take months or even weeks. This kind of work can be done in a week, but you need to sit down with, that list and, work through some definitions and take some stuff out, put some stuff in, be happy with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's one of the other issues that we always hear about, is that when we talk about these ideas and these strategies, that the challenge with them is that they require some sort of upfront work that is difficult from a time standpoint, a headcount standpoint to do, but it pays off in the long run. It makes it makes it easier to continue to do. But yeah, there is some work that needs to be done upfront.
But I'd even say with that, Dave, like, yeah, you're right. So there's paying the price up front makes a lot of sense. But I mean, for most companies, even large companies, my advice would be just get going with something early on. Make sure it's possible to tweak it, sort of 3 months down the line, because you cannot forecast how things are going to go exactly. But if you've got like a pretty good idea of what growth mindset is, then just go with that. Go with a skills framework. Get it tagged and make some progress. You'll refine it as you go. I mean, that's exactly the sort of agile mentality and methodology, and I think it's even better suited to as time elapses and we go further into the future. Staying agile is kind of essential now.
Mm-hmm. So talk to us a little bit about using the content to drive the skills.
Well, I think if you've understood content, if you've thought hard about the skills and what you mean by the skills, so kind of what we've just been discussing, then you've got something that you can tag. You can't really tag until you've got to that stage, because what are you going to tag with? So you've got those terms. Let's say there's 50 skills. Okay, so then we need to know what content is really going to help move the needle for your workforce with those skills. and you might be facing 100,000 items of content. The search results there's just a lot of them on your learning system. So what are you going to do? Well, one of the things that you can do is work with us to tag the content. And if you tag all of the content with with all of the relevant skills, then you've gone a long way to work out how useful that content en masse in totality is for the skills that you want to address. And from that point, then there's all sorts of things that you can do. You can aggregate up by provider, and then say, well, these providers should be in and these ones should not be in. So that's the procurement piece that I talked about. Or you can do curation. So you can say, well, we really need to build some playlists or pathways or run some campaigns on such and such a topic. Now we've got the content tagged with those topics. Here's a ready-made list, which probably a human being is still going to need to go through and make cohesive and add some commentary to, and some company context. But it massively accelerates the process. So the idea is, get the skills first, tag the content, and then you can line that content to those skills and deliver that in various ways. Just for curators, could be for the workforce through an email campaign, could be on an LXP, but it gives you the data and the power to be able to do that.
So coming back to some of the things that we've found as to why this can be so important and so impactful, we go back to those high impact learning organizations where the learning approach is having a strong impact on those outcomes. Again, some of the things that occur that are different in those organizations is they're much more likely to have a better ability to search and explore and discover learning opportunities, and that experience can't exist without the things that Marc's been talking about, because you've probably experienced it in your own life. If you get overwhelmed with irrelevant search results, it's impossible to know what to look at, what you should look, and you can spend the majority of your time doing the searching and not actually using the material that you're finding. So that we know that the way that people interact with most applications, web pages, what have you, is through search, right? You open a learning platform, you open a web page, anything that you do, you'll be presented with some sort of dashboard that will show you various bits of hopefully relevant information. But if you don't find what you need right away, the very next step will be search. And so that experience has to be really well done. And without this kind of tagging, you can't expect learners to be getting the right relevant returns in their search. The other thing that these companies do, and you can see the difference here, 57% versus 15%, is providing learning recommendations. Again, recommendations, very difficult to do without the proper tagging to know what the crossover is between one set of content and another, where, okay, we know that this was effective or this you found useful. Let's find the other things that are tagged like that, and we can recommend those to you. And then also a personalized learning plan where learners can track their own progress. That personalization can't really occur without a proper tagging and alignment strategy. So, we find that this is a very impactful learning experience, and it should have these elements, and without things that we're talking about, that can't exist. I mean, these some of the things that you see as outputs when you're working with clients, Marc.
Well, we think about search and recommendations, really a lot, and actually the difference between the two is, so they're obviously, so the top two items on your slide there. The difference is actually really important. I think it's interesting. So search implies that there's a very specific intent from the user. They've got a specific idea in mind of what they want to find. So I key in a specific term like agile project management, and I hope the system's going to pick up on that intent and return me useful results. The problem is, and I would encourage everyone to gather some data on this, run your own survey on your workforce. How happy are they with the results that come from search queries on your system? Because very often it's either too much or nothing at all that comes up, and in many cases also just not relevant stuff. So so maybe a system's working perfectly, but getting some data from end users on search results is really interesting, and it'll uncover whether you've got a problem or not, and whether maybe you don't need tagging whatsoever. but I would say, in many cases you will. So that's search where you've got a really specific, item in mind. Recommendations come in when the user doesn't have a specific item in mind. They're kind of, they're browsing on the system and they're just there. But on the basis of profile and probably historic, usage of the system, the learning system will make some recommendations to that user, but they will be a bit, they'll be a bit hit and miss because it's not as specific an input as a search query. But both of them require nuanced tagging that makes sense for the company and for the user. So, not just sort of a company set of skills that make sense for the company, but relate to, search queries that the user actually will will put in. So tagging is kind of fundamental to either of those. But I think it's worth thinking about the the different use cases and different user experience, search versus recommendations and browse.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about improving discoverability.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've touched on it already with or a little bit anyway, with okay, so I'm going to say something which sounds a bit like a tongue twister, but it's sort of like or a riddle. Anyway, it's kind of, you need to get your head around it. But tagging and curation are really two sides of the same coin. So if you associate an asset like a learning object with a skill, that sounds a lot like tagging, because you're taking, say, an article on HBR or whatever, and you're saying this is about growth mindset or resilience or whatever. So that sounds like tagging in a lot of people's heads. But imagine the other way around now, that you associate a skill, say resilience, with an asset. So you start with resilience, and then you say this asset is relevant, and this asset is relevant, and this other asset is relevant. That sounds like curation, but really you're doing the same thing. You're just associating the two, a skill and an asset. They're two sides of the same coin. So I think that's I like to think that that's a useful way of thinking about this stuff for a start. And I mean, we're trying to improve discoverability in two ways. I mean, one is, first of all, is just by developing a methodology and technology which will do all of that tagging stuff, the tagging curation. It's been described by some people as L&D voodoo, but it's not that mysterious. I mean, look, if you give us a couple of skills and some content, we can run content intelligence on it and give you some results free of charge, for example. And I'd say that actually in general, there's a lot of vendors that talk about and in many cases have AI, but if they can't point to the benefits and give you some sort of tangible output, I think it's less appealing. I mean, I would feel that that's less appealing as a as a buyer. And once you're convinced that it works, you can see that curation is going to be done to a higher standard, because you're uncovering those gems of content that are really good and pertain to that particular skill, but were being lost before. It'll also get done 5 to 10 times quicker, because you're saying, curator, hey, look, here's a ready-made list. You need to just choose from this list rather than start from scratch. And then going sort of down the line with end user discoverability. So what I've said so far is more sort of L&D teams to build campaigns and pathways and playlists and what have you. Further down the line, you want to improve the experience of the end user. So that'll be where you enrich the metadata and then you re-upload that to an LXP like Degreed, for example, and then on that platform. So it's not our platform at all. The end user experience would be on whatever that LXP is. Then all of a sudden the assets are just far more findable. They were searchable before, but they're now findable because they are better tagged. So that's where discoverability comes in. To be honest with you, we find the greatest and most urgent pull from the market is when there's an RFP around content, and so there's like there's a specific thing that's coming up. We need to make some decisions about content. So can you run content intelligence with your content and give us some data to help with that decision? And then the sort of more steady state use case is curation and discoverability. But all of this stuff is it's important.
Yeah. And you have actually a case study of an organization you work with to walk through some of the stuff and some of the results they had. But so let's talk about that. But I was just thinking about what you're saying, and one thing we always need to remember about our learners is there are a lot of cases where, it's that difference between search and recommendation, and it makes me think of, there are times when learners know what they don't know, and so they go looking, but there are obviously many times where a learner doesn't know what they don't know, and without this kind of tagging, those questions never get answered, because in the case of, they don't think to search that because they don't know that it's something that's important to them, don't know that it's something that's available to them, or that they don't know about. And that's why we need that stuff on the back end to be able to do that for them. But talk to us a little bit about this particular case study.
Yeah, we've got a graphic on exactly that, Dave, by the way, the unknown unknowns, and maybe actually get that into the pack that gets shared after this. This case study was a pharma company. We actually do a lot of work with the large pharma companies that that are obviously very much in the spotlight at the moment. With this one, we've been working with them for I think 18 months. We initially it was skills framework design, or helping them with that. Once we had that, like I've explained before, we ran the content intelligence algorithms through all of their content, build the belief with some early results that this actually works. So it's all very well a vendor saying, hey, we can do it to human standard. Well, give us a list then, and get a human to do it as well, and see how different those lists are. We'll get the human to mark the machine's work, but built the belief, and now we provide quarterly content refreshes, down to the asset level, and we're very much in steady state. The cost saving is well into 6 figures, and that comes from identifying content spend that is either totally redundant because there's just overlap with other content, or there's data that we can provide that can just help with the negotiation with the content vendor, that look, it's not totally redundant, but it's not as useful as the vendor's been saying. So how about a discount of whatever it is. There's another case study which actually I was closer to, which was more about do we have the right libraries? So at big companies, as you will know, Dave, there's very often a couple of very large incumbent content providers, and those are, frankly, they are most often LinkedIn Learning and Skillsoft. I think everyone just knows that. So with this other situation, we ran content intelligence through a huge number of assets, about 300,000. So some providers that they had, and some providers that they were considering, and help them with the economic decision, which they had a hunch, actually, an inclination towards that. One of the two big ones they didn't need, but now all of a sudden there was the data that said that. So there's $1 million a year, something like that, that could be spent elsewhere, or allocated to some different learning activities, or some other activity, or just save the money. But having the data finally to be brave and make that decision. So I talked about two there. The first was more sort of curation focused and skills framework design, and then curation. The second one was more to do with making sure that spend is going in the right way, going in the right places.
Right. And to be able to have data to make those decisions is critical, because a lot of organizations don't come with that, don't have that available to them. And so the decisions are being made on many other things that might not be the right reasons. So,
and when you said before, Dave, like at the top of this webinar, well, the data exists. So there's definitely some data. So all of these all these large companies will have some data through the LRS or LXP or LMS or whatever it is, on like usage by this provider, usage by that provider. Because there's so much that's tangled up in that, like, well, we did this campaign for this provider, or this provider was sitting on this other system, or it was advertised in this other way. You're not comparing like with like, and that leads to this decision paralysis, because well, you can't really compare A with B because there was all these differences. So we better not make any decisions. So we just leave things how they are for another year, another year, and that's not an inspiring outcome for the end users, for the workforces. So we're coming along and saying, hey, look, here's a better way of actually comparing like with like, and that will, that may well break you out of that inertia and make some bold decisions that you weren't able to make before because you didn't have the data.
Yeah. Absolutely. So we did have one of the questions that came in. You had mentioned something at the top when we were talking about the content that companies are sitting on, like the kind of volume of material that they have. Just if you would reiterate the 3 buckets that you guys think about them in. Was it proprietary, licensed, and web content, or was I?
Yeah, basically that. So yeah, proprietary, we mean the stuff that you make yourselves. Web is web, of course. I mean, there's some nuance to that, but web is web. And then it's, yeah, those libraries, a couple of the large ones I just mentioned, but of course there's many libraries. And yeah, it's all 3 of them. And we think we use those buckets because that kind of splits things up. All 3 of those categories are important. In general, we find that there's most opportunity, I think, with proprietary and web content. I think most companies feel they could make better use of the web, but they're worried about rights and restrictions and quality and cohesiveness. And with proprietary content, like I said before, a lot of the data is not very, the metadata is not very good, so that's tricky. But there's big opportunity with both of those. And with library spend, I think there's just big savings to be made. So there's opportunity in all 3 buckets, actually.
Yeah. So one of the things that comes to mind is, as you talk through this, we're talking about things that L&D typically hasn't tackled or done a great job of tackling. So as we think about this, and obviously, you guys represent a tool to help do this, but what about on the L&D skill side? What's a skill set or something that L&D should be looking for internally to help them manage this kind of process or get this going? Is there something that might be missing from the toolbox from an L&D skill set? Because we get these questions a lot from organizations, is what kind of skills should we be looking to add to L&D? So is there something like that from some other part of the business or some other field of expertise that maybe L&D hasn't been thinking about?
I think they have been thinking about the example I'm going to give, but there's still work to be done. So I would say it's data and data skills in order to inform decision making. I think that's just so important, because otherwise you just go with the flow, not in a good way, in a bad way. Like you just go with the inertia. So I think, yeah, developing those data skills in order to specifically make better decisions, bolder but correct and justified decisions. I think that's it's a key thing. And with data skills, it's partly technical, but I'm not talking about data science here. I'm not talking about even data analytics. I'm talking about better use of Microsoft Excel, so that you can synthesize different data sources, make some comparisons on a spreadsheet. I'm talking about that, and then also understanding and persuading and storytelling that goes along with that. I actually wrote an article with in Harvard Business Review with Josh Bersin about exactly this. So something is, if you Google boost your team's data literacy skills, and we were both, in that article, we're talking about both things. It's first, some of the hard skills that that we need in business to be able to understand data better, but also the soft skills that go with that, and like storytelling and presentation and making a convincing argument is a lot of that. So yeah, maybe we can send around, maybe add that in the references of the pack. But I think that's data skills to support decision making would be big one.
Yeah, I think we've been seeing that too, that companies are looking to get better data analysis skills within the learning function, or at least available to the learning function. And like you said, it doesn't necessarily have to be full-blown data scientists, but folks that are better able to understand how to ask the right questions and get those answers. One last thing, what about when you think about tagging? And so, because a lot of times we've been talking about how this can get relatively personal to each organization, is part of the strategy for the organization to sit down, like learning leaders, business leaders, to sit down and come up with a unified language about how we're going to talk about these things? Because you might have in one part of the organization might talk about a skill in a certain way, whereas another part of the organization might talk about it in another way. Do we need to have sort of that come together, or is that something that's part of a process later on where L&D can just meld things together, or should they come up with sort of a standardized way of talking about these things?
I think standardized is, of course, that sounds nice, and want to get there. And if you can imagine that working across the organization, the whole sort of employee life cycle from hiring and job descriptions through to onboarding and then learning and development, and even offboarding. So you can see how that's the sort of the dream. But when most companies are a long way from that. I think for now, what makes sense is to have some sort of definitions. So whether they're like ours, which are kind of part numeric and partly sort of word based, or whether they're just in sentences, then at least you can kind of say, well, we meant by resilience this. What did you mean by other department? Otherwise, you're just talking at cross purposes, and it leads to friction at some point down the line, or inefficiency, or people just not delivering the thing that was asked of them.
Yeah. Well, we've come upon the top of the hour, so I want to thank everyone for joining us. Of course, Marc, thank you so much for sharing your insights and the frameworks. Very important stuff that we're talking about here. Again, I appreciate everyone's participation and questions, and of course, thanks to Filtered for providing the hour for us. So yeah, Marc, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure, Dave. Enjoyed that.
Right. Great, and we hope to see you all again on another webinar. So thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Bye.